Hello, good afternoon. Buenas tardes, and welcome to Spain Pavilion again. I have seen several of you in previous sessions today. Here we have today, as in many others, other pavilions, the Day of Oceans and Water. I think this is really a very important day because, as you know, we are in a blue COP. So we had several events today dealing with water specifically, adaptation, scarcity, and now we will deal with a very interesting issue, which is how to really make out of the adaptation plan something that really integrates water. So still we will have another session later, but I hope you can stay here in this session, but also in the coming session. And now I would like to introduce Josefina Maeztu, and of course, thank you very much, Josefina, for organizing this event, and you can introduce all the speakers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alicia. And thank you to all the attendants here and to all the speakers today. And welcome, of course, to the Spanish Pavilion and to the last event of the Water Day. I suppose it's the last event of the Water Day. It's not the last one, it's one more. Okay. So we are here today to discuss basically two things, okay? Very simple. One is the importance of integrating water in national climate plans. So water in the national adaptation plan is important, and also what is how we can do to prioritize the water topic both in the COP processes and at national level. So what can the international community do to help in these processes as well, to make them different? So very simple, two questions. The answers are going to be long and they are going to be important. So to do that today, we have, first of all, Henk Obink, our co-organizer of this event from the government of the Netherlands, who is going to tell us a little bit about what has been going on water today. There's been many events, no, Henk, all over the place, and we want to make sure that this is part of the whole process that is happening here at Blue COP. So please come here. Thank you. Henk Obink is the special envoy for water affairs from the Kingdom of the Netherlands. Thank you.
The applause should actually be for Josefina, of course. Thank you for being such a good and strong partner. Also on behalf of the Dutch government, thank you again, Spain and Chile, for organizing this climate conference here in Madrid. It's been a welcoming event, and at such short notice, the Netherlands really applauds all your collective effort and really think it's amazing. Yes. Yeah, Jennifer, yeah. You can applaud, yeah. Yeah, this is for Spain, yeah. Applause for Spain. Yes, you can. Very good. But there's another reason, and I said it this morning too, is that while water is critically important both in the mitigation and adaptation part of the climate debate, and for water people that was like a normal thing, perhaps the most normal ever, outside of the water world that consciousness was not so much there. So we felt a little bit left behind, or actually a lot. So the whole argument on why water in the mitigation and adaptation field was so important, and one of the reasons that's complex was that whatever you invest in water, in understanding it, valuing it, and managing it, pays off outside of the water sector. So with great water, it's good health, so your health costs go down, but the Minister of Health never talks to the Minister of Water, perhaps only over drinks. And when you ensure that there is water availability and there's more opportunities for women and children, the people that are responsible in the social sector never talk to the people that actually make sure that water is available 24/7 and that there's price on its services and there's a guarantee on its quality. When there's no water, there's no food security. And I must admit, and I will say a bit about this, we have a Global Commission on Adaptation, a commission co-chaired by Ban Ki-moon, Bill Gates and Kristalina Georgieva. divided in different tracks. One of the tracks is food security. And I found myself in a room a little bit like this, although it was a round table, with people from around the world, ministers, professors, investors, talking about food security. And after 3 hours, I raised my hand and said, I haven't heard the word water once. And the response was, yeah, but that's not our problem. And it really scared the out of me. So water is often left out of the equation. And then again, looking at this COP, coming from Paris, with the Paris Agreement, 4 years after, it's amazing. And you see water everywhere, in every debate. There's a massive amount of organization. There's research in front of us, so the data and the science tell us. But it's also the practitioners, the NGOs, the governments from all layers and levels from across the globe that are talking water. The problem only is that there is a reason for that. And the reason is that the crisis is only increasing, so the impacts of water is also increasing. And we know that climate change hits us, humans, but also our biodiversity, our economies, everything we build up. We are hit hardest from climate change by water. Too much and too little hits us everywhere. 90% of all natural disasters are water related. Yeah. So it's great to have this massive amount of water conversations. Last, the Netherlands is a watery place. You know, perhaps it's a small country in Europe, 26% below sea level, 29% above. Last year we had a very massive drought, longest ever, and the second drought in our history. Until this day in the Netherlands, in the east, we have a water deficit in our groundwater. So even the extremes in such a place as the Netherlands become more extreme, and climate change is only making it worse. So we support, we partner, and we welcome the conversation. I'm encouraged by all the solutions that are also on the table. And last, I want to say for the Global Commission on Adaptation, this is for the Commission the year of action. Water is one of the action tracks. We focus on human and on ecological systems. We want solutions on the table. And on October 22nd, we will host the first Climate Adaptation Summit in Amsterdam, where water again will have a global platform. And whatever comes out of that summit, of course, will go to Glasgow for the next COP. We need you as partners in bringing the best solutions, mechanisms, and ideas forward, but also the way on how to do it, how to ensure that water security is a driver in the battle of climate change. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Henk. Thank you very much. Now I'm going to ask John Matthews, the Executive Director of the Alliance for Global Water Adaptation, to give us a keynote speech. I mean, John Matthews is somebody so important now in the world of global water adaptation, and she's really providing the pathway that we can all follow. And so thank you very much.
Thank you. That's a very warm welcome. I want to address what I'm sure is the first question that this audience in particular is wondering, which is, why is agua spelled with a W? Why did we misspell the word water? Well, the co-founder of Agua, he's actually from Uruguay, so I blame it on him. That was the best that we could do with the acronym for Alliance for Global Water Adaptation. So I'm going to start today with a short story that I think encapsulates some of the big ideas that we're trying to address. 2 years ago, I was in Asia, and I was on collaborating with some British colleagues, and we were meeting with a deputy energy minister. And we went into his office, and he didn't want to meet with us. He said, I understand you want to talk about climate change. And we said, yes. He said, I want to let you know that here in this country, we don't really care about carbon. And I looked at my colleague, and she looked at me, and she said, well, we don't really care about carbon either. And then he was really surprised by that. deputy minister then said, well, then you must be here to talk about the environment. And my colleague looked at me, and I looked at her, and she said, we don't really care about the environment either. And he said, well, why are you here? And I said, you are a country that is now investing in a huge new power plant. Is that right? Yes. It's a thermal plant. Yes. And it's cooled how? It's cooled by water, of course. Where does that water come from? It comes from a canal. Actually, I said, it doesn't come from a canal. It comes from a river. That river is connected to the Himalayas. And in the Himalayas, there are a whole network of glaciers and snowpack. And they are in very rapid evolution at this moment. And 5 years ago, you had century-scale flooding in this country. And 2 years before that, you had century-scale droughts in this country. There are 70 million farmers in this province alone. What I want to know is when you hit the next drought, and you go to your prime minister, and you have to negotiate about who gets the water, who's going to win? Is your new thermal plant going to get the water, or are the farmers going to get the water? Have you thought about that? He was very quiet for a minute, and then he said, now I know why you're here. So we had a great conversation after that. My job here is to help feed this conversation a little bit, provide some water-centric solutions. I'm borrowing from a title of a publication that Mark Smith at EME and I have just come out with, but I'm also using a phrase that's here that this morning in the Water Action event this morning, Gonzalo Munoz, the climate champion from Chile, used, which I was very moved by, that he talked about the need and importance of resilient water knowledge. And if there's one phrase that you take away from this, I hope it's that one. So I've structured this in just a couple of slides, and they're by the questions that the panelists are supposed to respond to. So at the first level, thinking about national plans. Can we see the water? So the challenge here is, can we find the water risk and the water commitments at a national level? So who's doing a good job? On each slide, I'm going to talk about one really good example. In this case, Egypt and their NDC. If you haven't looked at it, I strongly recommend that you do. It's an excellent NDC for recognizing the significance of water as a fundamental aspect of both their mitigation and their adaptation plans. They see it as central to disaster risk management, to urban resilience, to thinking about stormwater. They also make that direct connection that deputy minister in Asia did not, right to their energy systems, because they have a mixture of hydropower and thermal energy systems. How do we implement that? Most countries are, in the face of climate change, are having to reprioritize where they assign water, because the amount of water that we have is changing. We can't assume that those conditions are going to stay the same. The commitments that we have now probably need to be flexible. And we have some new types of institutions. The EU Water Framework Directive, actually, even though it doesn't mention climate change explicitly, it has turned out to be actually a very good adaptive water management mechanism. In Tanzania, the Pangani Basin is one of the world leaders in adaptive water governance. The North American Great Lakes have a special new climate adaptation committee just to be able to renormalize the system for shifting conditions for a vast array of different types of stakeholders. And lastly, I want to point out that in many cases, at that national level, we need to revalue water in new ways. The Netherlands here has actually been very important with their Valuing Water initiative. I believe it's in collaboration with the OECD too, to think about how water is changing, and in the context of uncertainty, how we need to think about its value over time. Below the national level, we need to think about governance, and we need to think about how we make policies resilient. That's between ministries, but it's also between levels of governance. So who's doing a good job? Mexico is doing a fantastic job. Their NDC recognizes the potential for conflict between levels of government, and that water must be coordinated across these scales in very careful ways. What I find especially exciting in the context of the megacity of Mexico City, they actually have also included the ecosystems and the environment as an explicit stakeholder in a partnership with something like 4 dozen different stakeholders. It's a group that also includes the World Bank as one of the key members, but many, many other groups in civil society, as well as federal and state governments. So how is this being implemented? We actually see really advanced thinking around this kind of multi-level governance, progressive thinking in the Philippines and Bangladesh and South Africa, places that you don't necessarily think of as progressive thinkers on the edge of these issues. Managing demand to increase, to buffer increased unpredictability, higher uncertainty is actually a really new practice that we're starting to see actually moving between governance levels in interesting ways. Spain, Pakistan, and Zambia have all been very recent leaders in this area. Lastly, food is very interesting. The FAO has started a partnership across Asia to actually focus on exactly this issue, trying to look at increased food production, water sustainability, and climate resilience, all in the same framework. Mitigation is not often a topic that we think of with water. Maybe, given my initial example, it makes sense to call it out as a separate slide. But our mitigation commitments, arguably the most important goal that we have in the UNFCCC, is it needs to be secured by resilient water management. So who's doing this? Nepal is very seriously worried about this, and they're actually making very progressive steps in this direction. Why is that? Because this is a country with very limited natural resources. What do they have? They have what an engineer calls head. They have a high part of the country and a low part of the country, and they have rivers, and they can make hydropower. But they've already seen very dramatic impacts on the amount of energy they produce and the reliability of that. So they are actively including climate adaptation into their energy planning. We see even with even broader groups of types of energy production, more integrated thinking from places like France and Japan, and new standards that are starting to come out to provide coherence around water and energy production. So in effect, we need to make sure that our climate mitigation is actually well adapted from a water perspective. And then lastly, what can the water community as a whole do to really support the national actions that are starting to occur? And one of the big insights that we've seen just in the past 5 or 10 years is the idea that we need to shift to managing for waterscapes. We often think about water as isolated, in particular rivers, lakes, maybe groundwater if we're being really creative, or in some places where we have a cryosphere, where we have ice and snow. Who's doing a good job of this? Uganda. Uganda has a fantastic section in their NDC talking about wetlands that's fully integrated into both their climate mitigation and their climate adaptation program. And they integrated it across a wide range of sectors within the country, from livelihoods to cities to agriculture. Who is implementing this already? In the UK, an organization that's co-sponsored, public and private, called Flood Ray, has a 40-year mandate to help manage flood control for places like London by looking at very distant areas in the northern part of the country by actually changing land management practices. This is exactly the kind of thing that we've been thinking about in a visionary way for decades, but that they're really implementing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. So there is quite a lot going on, no? It's not really, so we are not starting. There's quite a lot happening. And also, nice, no, Jennifer, that we have some place also for the kind of initiatives that the World Bank has been having. So thank you. So now, Jennifer, I pass the floor to you so you can introduce. I will introduce the speakers, yes. First of all, I would like to introduce to you Jennifer Sarah, who is the director for the Global Water Practice of the World Bank and one of the persons who is always there for all of us. Constantly traveling. She was in Fiji and she was in Egypt just before coming here. So I don't know what you were doing the 2 weeks before, but really was all over the place. Then we have a very good panel today. We have Cristina Narbona, who is the Vice President of the Spanish Senate, and we know you had a busy day today because it was Constitution Day, so you have to do a lot of work trying to basically celebrate our Constitution. And she was also the former Minister of Environment, and I worked there for you, so thank you very much for being here. We also have Ingrid Hoven. He is the Director General in the Federal Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development of Germany, and I know you've been doing a lot of work producing guidance precisely to help people, to help other countries to also incorporate water in the adaptation plans. So thank you very much for being here today. I have to excuse Andres Cove, the Minister of Science and Technology of Chile, because as you know, we are having at the same time negotiations, and people are really coming out of the negotiations. And this is also the case of Musonda Mumbi, who is the Chief Terrestrial Ecosystem of UNEP. She said that as soon as they're finished, she will come here and join the panel as well. So we have asked Leo Heller, who is the UN Special Rapporteur on the human rights to safe drinking water and sanitation, to join us in the panel. Leo, in fact, the first public event you ever did in your new position was in Spain, was in Zaragoza in 2015. So here you are back, and I hope that we can hear from you as well. So Jennifer, pass on the...
Well, thank you very much. Is this working? Okay, well, good afternoon, and I'm absolutely delighted to be here to chair this illustrious panel to talk about a subject that I'm passionate about, but we're always talking to ourselves within the water community. So we're very interested to hear about views from people who are not necessarily from the water community. So let me start with our host country, and again, happy Constitution Day, and thank you again for hosting the COP. We really appreciate it. So Cristina, the first set of questions is really about what are you doing in Spain in terms of looking at water, looking at climate, NDCs at the country level. Are you engaging with other sectors? Are you engaging with different levels of government? So please just tell us what you're doing in Spain on water adaptation and mitigation. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I don't know if you can hear me. Yes? So thank you, and thank you very much, Josefina, for organizing this meeting. So I have to say that in Spain we are shifting the water national policy in a very hard way, because until a few years ago, the national water policy was based in the consideration of water without any limits. No quantitative, no qualitative limit. So the only issue was to build infrastructures in order to storage and to transfer water from one place to another. And 1 year ago, we had a specific parliamentarian commission about climate change and water policy. Then the conclusions of this parliamentary commission has been adopted by the current government, the acting government now, in order to create the basis for a new approach to the water policy in our country, of course, according to the European Framework Directive, but nevertheless taking into account much more than ever the forecast about climate change and their consequences on Spain, which are very, very serious, because Spain is one of the countries where the reduction of rainfall will be very, very important, and also the intensity and the frequency of floods will be very serious. And let me tell something that is very well known by Spanish people here, I know, but not for other people. I will tell you about the case of the Minor Sea, El Mar Menor. Minor Sea is a lagoon in the region of Murcia. Murcia is one of the regions with an important activity in the agriculture, where there has been a very important work in terms of more efficient irrigation, but nevertheless, we have very important lack of control about the exploitation of groundwater and also the pollution coming from the agricultural sector, and in particular from nitrates.
Yes.
So, some weeks ago, we had a first extreme meteorological phenomena called Dana, with a lot of water coming down until the Minor Sea, transporting every kind of polluting substances. And then we could see in this Minor Sea, which is a very well-known touristic place, thousands of fishes who were dead because of the pollution. And this was such an important evidence of the danger of the combination of lack of policy and consequences of the climate change. Spain has adopted, when I was the minister, has adopted the first national adaptation plan on 2006. And of course, there is a chapter devoted to water. And now the current government is revisiting this plan in order to include new forecasts and new scientific knowledge about the relations between climate and water. For us, is one of the main issues. And I am sure that if it is possible to continue with our government, which is in a very strange situation, acting government, but nevertheless, as you can see, we are able to organize something like this. So I hope we can also continue and move forward in this new approach to water policy, including climate change, and in particular, including the necessary adaptation to climate change. And this means, for instance, to increase water treatment in order to reuse water and to use this water in the agricultural sector, and of course, to increase the efficiency and to use the new technologies as desalination in order to reduce the vulnerability of some of these regions which have been receiving water from other regions from Spain, where now the reduction of the rainfall is provoking a very dire situation. So we have to manage with this particular framework, and we have the political will to do it.
Well, thank you. This is incredibly inspiring. We often look to Spain about water management as such a great practice. Now, what really strikes me, what you say, is we always think about the impact of climate change on water, about having too much water or too little, the increase in variability, but you also bring in the issue of pollution. And that's really, really important. So we're seeing that climate change also is having impact on water pollution. So that's, and the fact that you also have a national adaptation plan that goes back to 2006. Maybe we'll come back to that a little bit later to understand more what you were thinking then versus what you're thinking now and what has changed. But perhaps we can go to Germany, and Ingrid also, to hear what you're doing at home. So in Germany, also very much out in front on the whole climate agenda. What actions are you taking in Germany? Is water part of your NDC? Is this part that comes into your negotiations? How do you see water and climate?
Yeah, thank you first for having me, and many thanks also to the Spanish government for hosting us here in Madrid for the Chilean COP25. At home, I think when we treated water as part of our national adaptation plan, I think many, many years ago, this was not being considered as a big subject, adaptation to climate change in Germany. So we were very much focused on the mitigation side, getting the energy transition in place, trying to actually to deal with public transport issues and so forth. And then a couple of years ago, we had the first bigger floods. And a lot of damage is also caused by extreme weather events on agriculture. And then the debate started, shouldn't we actually look more in depth into what is being needed at the local community level on adaptation to climate change, but much more on the side of having too much water. So normally Germany is known as a country with a lot of rain, and people actually go for vacation to other parts of Europe to have a sunny summer. And this has changed completely. We actually, this summer was the fourth summer in a row where we had severe droughts. And the humidity at 4 meters depth in our soil is so dry, we have never had this phenomenon in the past. Extremely high, actually, drought. And even we had quite a lot of rain in August and September. This couldn't actually remedy a lot of the lack of humidity. And this has a severe impact already on the productivity of agriculture, but of course also on the consumption of water. So drought is now added to a phenomenon where we have to deal with, and people have to get acquainted in the utilization of water in a different way. So this is now actually part of our agenda. Additionally, as I come from a development cooperation ministry, I have to say that the whole climate change debate is put back to the agenda as a top priority. I think last year when I was at a side event at COP24 in Katowice, somebody said, water is going to be to the adaptation agenda what energy has been to the mitigation agenda. And I think they're absolutely right. Because when you look at the water issues, you figure out that it's actually cross-sectional. And if you don't get it right, I mean, you lose a lot of opportunities. Look at a country like Ethiopia, growing in population. Less rainfall. They depend much more to feed their people on irrigation. Irrigation is being actually limited by scarcity of water. And on top of it, they need water for energy production. So there are competing needs. And nobody can tell you what does water resilience in 2040 mean actually. How do you manage those competing needs? And the same is true for countries like Pakistan, Nepal, and others. They say we lack this type of expertise, the forward-looking expertise that would tell us how do we deal with those competing needs, what is available, how can I make my country, my economy, my society more resilient. And this is an issue that we would like to put really on top of the agenda, make developing countries more knowledgeable about the right strategies, give them actually the methodologies and the toolkit that they need, and then start actually to factor in water needs and issues very systematically into MDCs on both sides, mitigation and adaptation. But I think right now, this is what I get when I talk to developing countries, many lack this type of medium-term knowledge, the perspective, and then to take it from there and figure out what kind of investment do I need right now. I mean, they are adapting like what is obvious, a little bit patchy investments, a little bit of water resilience activities here, smaller dams, but this is not sufficient. We are lacking this broader perspective. This is actually one of our key priorities and investments that we provide to our partner countries, because unless we know how big are the climate risks, how the different parts of the economies and the society are being effective, how can you make, as a finance minister, the right choice in your investment plans? And this is hopefully is a debate that we can bring forward with these side events, placing water here very, very much on top of the agenda at climate conferences. But I think we have to bring this back into those arenas where finance ministers sit at the table, and we will have to tell them, look, I mean, if you want to deal with climate change, you have to deal with the water issues that are actually putting a lot of your economy at risk.
No, and thank you very much, because I think it's interesting. We're always thinking about something that might happen in the future. You're worrying about that. Climates, you can't really feel the carbon necessarily, but you can feel the impact through the water cycle. And like you're saying, Germany going from floods to drought, that is such a radical impact to the population that it really does stimulate the need for action. And the action you take in Germany, how can you share that with so many other countries around the world? I mean, the need for action is now. So I think that's a very important point. Let me turn over to you, Leo. You have a really, really important job in terms of looking at the human rights and the human rights to water. And we look at SDG 6, which gives you a nice framework for universal access to water and sanitation. It talks a lot about water quality. So how do you see that all fitting in, the human rights agenda to the climate change and also to the water nexus?
Okay, thank you, Jennifer, for the question. I would start saying that if we feel that water is a kind of neglected issue in the COP25, human rights is much more neglected. Human rights is almost invisible in the discussions during the COP25. So the intersection between human rights and water is much, much more invisible, is inexistent almost. So I think we need to raise this issue, not only because I'm the special rapporteur, but because I really think that the human rights can provide an important framework to look at the consequences of the climate emergency. How I say that? Some people can argue, yeah, but there are some other ways to address human rights without using the language of the human rights. There are some movements of climate justice. We are talking about the SDGs, SDG 6. I would say, okay, these are maybe some proxies of the human rights, but they are not the same of human rights. The human rights framework is a comprehensive framework that provides us with several elements to face both the mitigation and the adaptation of the climate emergency. When we use this framework, we necessarily need to connect issues like accountability, like the right to participation, the right to information, the progressive realization, and mostly, I would say, a very important principle that is the principle of equality and non-discrimination. Equality and non-discrimination, I think, is a very, very key issue to use in addressing the consequences of the climate emergency. Because I was raising that earlier in other session today, if we treat in a uniform way all the populational groups, we are increasing inequalities. We need to treat differently the difference. This is the main issue when we discuss equality or equity in terms of policies and measures to face several public policies, but in this discussion, particularly the climate emergency. So my point, the point that I make, is that the climate emergency, the consequences of this phenomena on the population is not uniformly distributed among the different populational groups. And the groups that already face situations of vulnerability for different reasons, or because they are poor, or because they are indigenous, or because they live in the coastal areas, or because they live with disability, or because they are women and girls and need to carry water, or because they live on the streets, they are homeless, or are in detention centers. I'm talking about different groups that are particularly vulnerable in several societies. The climate emergency is including another layer of vulnerability on the already vulnerable conditions that they live. So my point is that in those plans on the mitigation, adaptation, and other measures to face the climate emergency, those populations needs to be addressed in a particular way with priority. We need to protect those people, because if we don't do that, the impacts on them will be devastating, and we need to look carefully on that. I'm not talking about the future. I'm talking on situations that already are taking place, and there are several evidences that when there are droughts or floods or the collapse of the infrastructure of water and sanitation, exactly those people are being the most affected. I can give several examples. I don't think I will have time to do that, but if it's the case, we can discuss this conversation afterwards. Thank you, Jennifer.
Well, thank you very much. I actually might take you up on that offer. You say on equity, we can't do everything equally. We have to change the way. And if I paraphrase you a little bit, you say, how do we give voice to the voiceless? And so let me turn that back to you. How do you bring people into the room, the people who are being most impacted, the people who have been excluded from service delivery? So please, I think it would be very nice if you could give us a couple examples of actions that you can do to really give voice to the voiceless in action as well.
Yeah, it's always hard to say how and to give examples that are prescriptive, because all the societies has their own context, reality, limitations, etc. But the human rights framework gives a very interesting definition of participation. The human rights framework says that participation should be active, minimal, and free. Meaningful and free. Active, meaningful, and free. So if we play with these three concepts, with these three adjectives, people will not be only consulted or only be present in a room to say, look, tick the box. We did the participatory activity. We need really to put the people in the center of the decision making. I think the main point is to include participation in the decision-making process, not only for the consultation, for information, or to say, look, you can have a flood in your home and maybe you need to be displaced. No, we need to involve in a good way, not involve in terms of manipulation. Involve the voices of the voiceless, as Jennifer referred, in the decision-making process, in thinking on the best way to think on adaptation plans, on mitigation measures, because these people know better than the technocratic approach what's the best way to address those needs.
Good. So, Cristina, as I was asking this question to Leo, you had a big smile on your face. And so you come from an interesting background, from having been the Minister of Environment and now being in the Senate. And so how do you get participation in Spain? What is it? How do you get people engaged on this whole agenda? And especially when you have to deal with conflicts and you have to reallocate water across sectors. How do you do it?
So, other than being the Vice President of the Senate, I am also the President of the Socialist Party. And in this capacity, I have been pushing in order to include the transition of our economy, the ecological transition of our economy, as a matter of priority in the political agenda. And indeed, now we have a ministry for the ecological transition, where you find not only environment as a whole, biodiversity, water, but also energy. So now we are trying to deal from a more holistic approach, and of course according to the Agenda 2030 of the United Nations, and according also to the accomplishment of the human rights approach, because in the Spanish legislation, water is a public good. And Spain has supported for many years the proposal of considering the access to water as a human right. So in further legislation that is being prepared today, we are focusing this idea of taking into account the amount of water totally free and available for the most vulnerable citizens. And of course, speaking about participation, Josefina Maestro is leading a very interesting process of participation in preparing a green book about the new water governance in Spain. because this is absolutely necessary to involve people in the decision-making process about water. In the case of Spain, we have mainly the groups of larger agricultural farmers and also the companies in the public works system. So other people, other citizens, people living, for instance, working with sports in the rivers or fishing, well, they were not considered as users of water, no? And of course, we have still now a small consideration about the ecosystem approach to the management of water. So these are all things to develop, but we have this framework, this European water framework, which is very interesting in the next process of planification in order to include also participation of people, and something that is very difficult in Spain, which is how to put a price on water. A price for those who can pay, of course, not for vulnerable people.
Thank you. I'm smiling because that issue is dear to everyone's heart. How do you value water and price services and make sure the poor still can access to service? And how do you value water against all competing needs, social needs, environmental needs, economic needs? And I guess, Ingrid, let me turn to you, because we do talk about this cross-sectorality, and you have a wonderful position in the sense as the head of the development cooperation for Germany, is you get to look across all sectors. And so when you think about water, and you talked a lot about wanting to support other countries like Pakistan, Ethiopia, with knowledge exchange, how do you bring in then this cross-sectoral approach when you think about your programming and bring water also through the lens of a cross-sector approach?
This is, in some cases, it's not that easy, because in many countries they lack a type of a cross-sectoral coordination mechanism. Some countries actually have created those mechanisms in order to formulate the first NDCs. And those mechanisms actually then provide a better platform to bring new stakeholders on board, and not only from the public sector, like within government, but also perhaps the private sector, or stakeholders and think tanks in the civil society. What we try to do as a member of the NDC partnership, the partnership that was created a couple of years ago in Morocco, and that provides support to developing countries for actually implementing the NDCs and for raising ambition over time. This is a mechanism that actually incentivizes cross-sectoral work at the country level, gives support, capacity building, institutional support and advice to build up this type of cross-sectoral institutional mechanisms that could be actually instrumental for implementing and formulating a better climate policy. In the case of in the water issues, for instance, in the Sahel region, where we have quite a strong program with a couple of countries, we have tried to bring together in our technical cooperation ministries like agriculture, water, infrastructure, and the environment to figure out, what does it take to make a region more resilient when it comes to livelihoods, agri-food production, but also water provision. And of course, quite frankly, in some countries you can see that there are, of course, competing also interests. So if you have, for instance, a sector where agriculture depends on irrigation and water is being subsidized, and therefore, of course, the agriculture production is perhaps cheaper than it should be, but you take groundwater. And this comes at the expense, perhaps, of a lack of water provision to the lower segments of your income strata. And they have to buy, pricey water by private provisioners. Is this a just utilization of the scarce water resources? But I think the only way to handle these issues is really to bring those people to the table and try to forge a consensus. It's not that easy. But I think this is a big issues, especially in those countries where some water utilization issues are being subsidized, perhaps at the expense of providing more investments to build up the infrastructure for those people that are more in need. It's just one issue. I tell you a story from Germany where we are facing a similar, I wouldn't say competition, but some kind of conflict. Germany's groundwater is being actually impacted by the huge utilization of fertilizers in agriculture. And this comes for many years. So of course, if you have a higher degree of pollution, you have a higher cost in making the water clean for drinking purposes. This type of cleaning up the water is being actually financed more or less by taxpayers, so all of us. So the cost of the utilization of a high degree of fertilizers in some parts of the agriculture industries is being more or less borne by the whole public. But of course, if you now say we have to take care of this, so we put a price on the utilization of fertilizers, of course you increase the cost of production. And quite recently, only a couple of days ago, we had huge manifestations in Berlin by the agricultural sector because they felt that the public and the government is putting too much pressure on them and increasing the cost of production and they are going to get out of markets. But who is actually going to lobby for all the consumers, for the local communities that actually want to provide safe and clean drinking water to all Germans? These are the types of conflicts that now become more obvious and where we have to find platforms, we have to speak, we have to explain more, and we have to bring those sectors that may have to transform a little bit quicker in order to provide safe water for all purposes that we need. And we have to make sure that, as you say, that the costs are being distributed in a fair manner. Fairness and equity is quite a big issue when it comes to water, and we are not yet there. And what it takes is really to build up the right consensus building mechanisms and the institutional platforms that we need to convince people that this transformation is to the best of all of us.
No, and thank you. I'm very interesting what you said about looking across sectors. Sometimes we put subsidies into the energy sector or into fertilizer agriculture. The unintended consequences that the subsidies lead to costs in other sectors. And so maybe, Leo, if I can just take that as a segue, like from the equity perspective as well, listening to this, how do you see it representing the human right? This whole issue of pricing is always a very important issue, basing rights and pricing and valuing water. Maybe a few words on that.
So, good question. Firstly, I realized that we have in the panel Spain and Germany. And Spain and Germany are the two sponsors of the human rights to water and sanitation. So we are lucky today, and it increases our responsibility on addressing the human rights. Yeah, the issue of pricing through the human rights point of view has two, I would say, dimensions. One dimension is, of course, it's important that water services are financially sustainable. It's important. It's an important dimension. Has not only to do with economics. It has to do with the sustainability of the services. When the services are not sustainable financially, the trend is to deteriorate rapidly. And when the system deteriorates, who will suffer? The same that I was discussing before, people that are less able to pay or live in more remote areas, etc., etc. The second dimension is affordability. Of course, this is a very, very key element of the human rights to water and sanitation. So the challenge, I'm thinking more on the services, not necessarily subsidies and taxes related to the use of natural sources. I'm thinking about the services. So affordability is very key. And the challenge is how to reconcile the financial sustainability with affordability. Some people usually argue that it's impossible to reconcile. We need to to charge the poor, or the less the systems will not be sustainable. It's not. I don't agree with this type of rationale. There are several ways and several experiences where system, even in developing countries, can be sustainable in terms of the financial revenue, but at the same time has different tariffs structure, not only tariffs, but using also subsidies, taxes, etc., in order to protect the poor. It's possible, it's feasible, it's only a question of putting a priority on those that can't pay or has less ability to pay, and to rebalance the way as the charges are transferred to the people. In some cases, it's not possible to have a full cost recovery through tariffs, and in these cases, it's possible to use other mechanisms in order to protect the poor. So affordability is a very key issue, and there are some situations very concerning where there are high tariffs for people that live in poverty, people can't pay, and people are disconnected from the system. Disconnection under the human rights framework is considered a violation of the rights. So it's important to take into account all these elements of the pricing in order to meet the obligations of the states in terms of the human rights framework laws.
Thank you. So I want to move back. I mean, we're lucky to have in the room people are in negotiating on the panel. So you are actually in the room negotiating. And so my question is, Ingrid, you said, how do you bring water from a side event to the main event? And we very much would like to be here as a water community to support you to do that. So maybe starting with Christina, it'll be the same question for all of you. Can you please, do you have any proposals on how we can integrate water into the whole COP process at the national level, at the global level? Really specific proposals, because everyone who works in water, we stand behind you, but you're out there negotiating. So let's start with you, Christina, please.
Thank you very much. My minister is negotiating, not me. So I can say that there are many opportunities to include the Article 7.4 of the Paris Agreement in the case of adaptation. For instance, in the field of the so-called nature-based solutions that need to find a place in the national adaptation plans. For instance, green infrastructures in cities along with sustainable transport systems, reduce energy use in a series of areas such as storm water storage and treatment, contribute to recharge water underground, support biodiversity, clean urban air and control temperature in heat waves. Secondly, this is why, starting with energy and water adaptation plans, we can see cities as the next level of integration of mitigation and adaptation policies. At national level, there are clearly synergies and co-benefits of mitigation and adaptation initiatives also in the field of water. And in rural areas, water adaptation strategies are linked to preventing desertification, and desertification is a matter in Spain. Almost 50% of our land is already under the risk of desertification. Promoting sustainable soil conservation practices while using the energy and hydrological transition as opportunities for a more balanced rural development. So these are some ideas our ministry is defending here.
No, fantastic ideas, and I think more and more people are talking, we say green, the engineers who talk gray infrastructure, but now it's the green infrastructure. Well, how do we go back to nature? And in fact, many of us are environmental engineers, which we might think is an oxymoron, but in fact it's true. How do you do engineering that works with the environment and use nature-based solutions? I think that's fantastic suggestions. And of course, though, don't forget, we're talking about the articles of the negotiations, Article 7.4, adaptation. So Ingrid, where do you see this then? How do we get into the main event and also make sure this is part of the negotiations and some binding commitments that that we can then support countries to deliver on?
Well, first, I think that already the Marrakesh Global Action Agenda has actually given space to speak more about implementation of the Paris Agreement. And this gives space actually to place new subjects, and they gain actually momentum. I would expect for the next year and in the run-up to COP26 that actually water issues are going to remain very prominent on the agenda. We expect very important reports that are going to highlight again the cost of doing nothing, not actually continuing to neglect water issues. So this is going to give momentum to action on the ground. More importantly, when you look at what has been delivered by parties with respect to the NDCs, you can already identify that in 70% of NDCs, especially for developing countries, the water sector is being mentioned, and partially with concrete action. This again underlines how important water issues are being considered by many, many developing and emerging economies. And the revision of the NDCs and the presentation, the run-up of this whole work at the country level with communities, with ministries, I think this gives, the best opportunities really to factor in a medium-term plan how to deal with water issues at the country level. And I think we should seize this opportunity, either by actually speaking to the peers, to environment ministers, to finance ministers. We all together in the development cooperation arena, MDBs, or we should make case and encourage developing countries that they really should put water on the agenda. It's so crucial when it comes to adaptation to climate change. So for me, this is one of the most important entry points in the next 6 to 9 months. And then certainly I think we have to make sure that we here and then perhaps highlight also how the private sector, how technological intervention can actually provide a new opening, light at the horizon. I think water is so much more difficult to treat than energy. It was like a simple, energy was a shortcut actually that we could implement. You said, okay, we get out of coal, we invest in renewable energy, the technology was there, solar panels, etc. Water is much more complex. It actually cuts across into all elements of our society and economy. There is not one silver bullet where you would say, I do this and then the issue is done. And therefore, I think it's so much more important to first continue to underline why it is needed to invest more in water issues, and secondly, really to think about the societal issues, the equity issues, the justice issues, because if you start to think about a climate change agenda that is also dealing with just transition, immediately you come back to the water issues. So for me, this is another, so to say, more programmatic entry point by making sure that we really put people first. And if you put people first, you end up in dealing with water issues.
No, thank you. That's a good one. Put people first, you end up with water. And we know what you're saying about water being everywhere and nowhere. And so when the Global Commission on Adaptation was preparing their report, they had cities, they had infrastructure, as Hank was saying, and there's no chapter on water because it's so diffuse. And so I think we really need to think through. But what you're saying also is getting the ears of the ministers of finance. You start talking to them about water, they get scared because they think about the cost of investment. But the cost of inaction, I think, is really important, what you said. So Leo, coming to you, it's the same question, but now that you sit within the UN actually has a UN Water Action Decade. How do you see this, and to use a UN system also to make water from a side event to a main event?
Yeah, of course, I'm not involved in the negotiations. I don't have this role. You can look my badge, I think it's a real different. It's blue, UN observer. So I don't have a role. But yeah, I think that one important issue is related to water allocation. And it's interesting because, again, using the human rights framework, the human rights framework would say that the priority in the allocation of water should be for human consumption and not for other activities. And there are this famous share of the use of water worldwide saying that water for human consumption is only 7%, 10% of all the water used around the world. 70% is for agriculture, 20 for industries, etc. So there's no problem in water for human consumption. It's only 7%. But there is. You can't look at these global statistics without looking at particular situations. And with droughts, with the climate emergency, these conflicts around the use of water certainly will aggravate. And I think this is something to take into consideration in the negotiations, in the documents to be adopted, because for instance, I did a report on the mega projects and the impacts on the human rights to water and sanitation. And it's very clear when you have a mining or a energy facility in an indigenous community sharing the same water sources, who will win in this conflict? It's clear to us in several situations the community is neglected. So the issue of keeping the principle of the priority in the allocation of water for human consumption, being cities or indigenous community, local communities, traditional populations, I think is very key in the looking at the future in the exacerbation of scarcity, of droughts, and the exacerbation of conflicts. And the conflicts will be harder to coordinate and to manage, and I think it's a key issue. And regarding the UN Water, I think UN Water is a great institution. It's not clearly an agency, it's a kind of coalition of all the UN agencies that work with water. I have attended some of the meetings of UN Water, and I think it's a very important platform because it can voice all the UN agencies that work with water in an integrated way, and these issues of allocation can be very well addressed by the UN Water.
No, thank you. And I mean, you brought up UN Water, which is interesting because UN Water exists and they do a very good function because they bring together 32 different agencies in the UN system that deal with water. So that already shows a bit that. But in addition to the UN agencies, it's also the UN process of the countries. And between the COPs, that's what we really have. Is looking at the UN General Assembly as another way of bringing together the heads of state and other representation from government. So we're going to wrap up. I want to thank everyone, but everyone gets one last word or several last words. One last question. Please inspire us, give us hope, and tell you what do you want from the water communities that you can really be out. We can be there to raise water in the agenda. So we'll just start with you and go down the line, Christina.
Well, of course, there is hope. There is hope, first of all, because scientific knowledge is already such a strong basis to act that if there is political will and there is also the social awareness about climate change and in particular about water policies and water programs, I think we have the opportunity to move forward. And of course, I would like to remind that we, as Spain, we are working not only considering our national problems, we are increasing again our cooperation with other countries, in particular with Latin America and with Africa. The director of the cooperation agency is here with us, Aina, and for many years we have had the experience of the Water Fund in Latin America, which is a very interesting experience, not only in terms of investment, but in terms of capacity building and in terms of participation of indigenous peoples, population, and taking into account also these different ways of approaching to the water problems.
Thank you. Leo, and then we'll go Ingrid, or do you want to go Ingrid and then Leo? We'll say the last word for you then.
I think we are really at a turning point, and I think the motto of this COP, Time to Act, is really absolutely appropriate. Why am I still hopeful, although we are moving still too slow? Because I see that a lot of our societies are moving into the right direction. As Christina said, awareness is bigger than a couple of years ago. They read much more about the evidence that is available, but especially I would say that the whole movement, Friday for Future, the many NGOs, the groundswell that it's out there, it's actually changing consumption and production patterns. So people ask for better food, for better water, are more conscious about what they are doing, where they are traveling, how they consume water during their vacations, or what for their daily purposes. And I think this is an important change, because if the level of consciousness increases faster, I think it will be easier also for the policy arena really to do the bigger steps and to achieve a higher and quicker transformation, what we actually need to do.
Okay, so thank you. Leo, you get the last word. Give us some hope.
No, first, my first word will not be very nice. I think we always need to say that it's unacceptable to have climate deniers in the global arena. We always need to say that in this type of sessions. Not deny the climate emergency. The climate emergency is here already, and we will aggravate in the future. So nothing to accept these types of approaches in the climate emergency. Second, I need to say that we need to put people in the core of the concerns related to climate emergency, particularly the poorest people, particularly the people that are the most discriminated in the societies. They will suffer more from the consequences of the climate emergency. So please put people in the center of the concerns.
Perfect. People, policies, politicians for the planet. Over to you, Josefina.
Thank you to all, and thank you for the 3 Ps. There are different Ps. I would ask you to stay in the panel here now, and I'm going to ask Ingrid Timboe, who's the policy director at AGUA. Ingrid, you've been listening very carefully and taking a lot of notes, I can see that. There's been a lot of good ideas here, and we started with John's statements about how people are progressing and what he thinks are the right way of doing things. So what do you think about what you have heard now? Thank you. And just before I give her the word, I would like to say that we have a representative from the government of the United Kingdom here. As you know, the next COP26 is going to be in Glasgow, and we would like her. We know you're in a very delicate position at the moment with the government, with the elections happening soon, so she has asked to be able to make a little intervention from the floor. So first I will ask Ingrid. You will just ask her? She should go first. Okay, there we are. Thank you.
Thank you. You want me to stay here? Good evening, everyone, and thank you to Spain for the kind invitation for the UK to participate in this esteemed panel. And I express my apologies that we were not able to take this up, but due to the strict rules around the general election occurring in the UK this week. So my name is Rosalind West, and I lead on climate science at the Department for International Development. So as you know, next week this week actually, the UK goes to the polls, and the good news is that all the major parties in the United Kingdom, in a large part in response to public opinion, have recognised the importance of climate change in their manifestos and promised that the UK will increase our endeavours to mitigate climate change and redouble our efforts to strengthen climate resilience. So water adaptation itself is very important in the UK. We've had our own recent experiences of severe weather with flooding in the north of England, and even in the UK, this can lead to loss of life and significant material damages. So there is clearly lots more to do, even in a large economy like the UK. However, it's critically clear that poor countries are far more vulnerable. And this is why the Prime Minister has doubled the UK's commitment to international climate finance at the UN Climate Summit in New York in September, and recommitted to a 50-50 split between mitigation and adaptation. We also increased our support to the Green Climate Fund, and we would encourage other developed countries with rich economies to follow suit. But of course, aid will never be enough, and we're determined to use some of this new money more strategically to encourage private capital to address water insecurity. We're also drawing up a new approach to water security that will engage with the City of London and various private sector instruments to help tackle the global water crisis. We also want to mobilise civil society to inform, to campaign and monitor progress, and so hold more organisations and individuals to account for their water impact, particularly where poor people and vital ecosystems are concerned. We want to ensure, and I really have taken so much up from this panel, so thank you, that water security moves right up the political agenda, locally, nationally and internationally. I'd also like to express our recognition for the work that has gone into the Watering the NDCs report. Thanks to GIZ and BMZ for funding this, and to congratulate the authors of that report from Agua and around the world. There's lots of sensible policy advice in there for the UK to consider and to take forward next year in the run-up to COP26. I'd also like to express our sincere congratulations to Spain and Chile for hosting the COP25. And I think that the UK has a lot to live up to next year. Now, the UK is committed to ensuring that COP26 is a pivotal moment for elevated and significantly increased global action on climate change. And we will draw heavily upon the recommendations of the NDC report and from this session to ensure that water features centrally at COP26. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I don't know whether we need Ingrid or a closure or anything. Let's go. Come on, Ingrid.
That was a good mic. Yeah. Oh, actually, I don't need that. I think I need mic. Okay. Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Josefina, for the introduction, and thank you so much, Rosalind, for attending and being able to make that pledge, basically, on behalf of the UK. We're thrilled to hear that, as Director General Hoven mentioned as well, that water will remain high on the agenda as we move towards COP26. So that's really, really great news. I am covered now in ink because I have been furiously scribbling lots of notes to summarize everything that has been said here. But I think it was really interesting. I mean, both Germany and Spain started off by saying, that even within their governments recently, they are already experiencing the effects of climate change, right? And that has sparked a new conversation in both of their governments in terms of shifting about how we think about water and climate change together. And not just for adaptation, but also for mitigation as well. And I think that's a conversation that is happening in Germany and Spain, and I think it's happening actually in countries around the world as well. And so that's really important to recognize, and we need to really harness that change in the conversation and bring it to the COPs, but also bring it outside of the COPs as well, and downscaling it to the cities. We've talked a lot about resilient cities in other panels and discussions over this week, and that topic issue came up again today. And I think that it's really important because as we are now moving into the implementation phase of the Paris Agreement, we are downscaling from the national governments down to where the action actually takes place, and it takes place at the city level. And so making sure that we are also looking at that. And also from Leo, bringing in important reminders that we need to really understand that the climate crisis is not evenly distributed, and so our responses also cannot be evenly distributed, and that we need to put people right at the center of the climate emergency and make sure that they stay there in all of our responses. And I think that's something that's really good for all of us to remember, certainly for myself as well, and the work that John and I do with all of our partners. Other than that, I think I might wrap it up. I think mostly covered some of the things that you talked about. And Vice President Narbona, you talked about hope, and I think that that's really important, that we maintain that hope, even though we know that we are not moving as fast as we need to move faster, but we also need to maintain that hope, and that is very good for me to hear as someone who works day in and day out on water and climate change. So thank you so much for those words, and thank you all for your contributions, and to Spain, of course, for hosting this event. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ingrid. I now like to give the word to Cristina Gallac. Cristina was the Undersecretary General of the United Nations for the DPI, the Department of Public Information, and she's now the Spanish SDGs High Commissioner. Cristina, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Josefina. And after these eminent panel comments, excellent contributions from other speakers, I'll try to close up with a personal experience and with some very generic views. Well, the personal experience is it came to my mind after John spoke about the Himalayas, and I'm going to talk about the Pyrenees. 90 years ago, in the Pyrenees, in a very remote village, extremely poor family, there was a woman that was being born, and that woman happened to be my mother. It was on December 2015, after the extraordinary events at the UN, when we got the SDGs approved and the Climate Paris Summit, in such a fantastic, agreement, I went to that remote village where my mother still lives, happily and, full of hope for the world. And I explained to her the 17 SDGs and the Paris Climate Agreement. And she was, she knew quite a lot, because although she's quite old, she's super on top of everything. And she told me, I like very much these SDGs. But I'll tell you something, Cristina. After my experience of my long life, the SDGs that count are water and energy. Having lived in such a place for several years, in particular during the Spanish Civil War and the terrible post-war experience, having no water, having no electricity meant total irrationality, total difficulties for us. The moment when we got water and electricity, we really moved on. So the SDGs 6 and 7 are key to many people in many remote countries in the world, but as well here in the Pyrenees. My second comments, or the following comments, are as follows. Yes, there has been an increased attention of water issues in COP25, in particularly since Marrakesh, so we all applaud. But we detected, and I want to mention you, Heller, that we need not only more cross-cutting SDG, more cross-cutting water in COP, but human rights. But I would like to add something else. You all have talked about planet, equality, inclusion, just transition. The word was missing, the 2030 agenda. So basically, what we have been missing from this discussion is basically just the framework where it all happens. All the transitions to better water supply, to mitigation, to adaptation, to just transition, to inclusion, to sustainable development, or the 17 SDGs. So thank you very much for this panel, for having this extremely inclusive SDG approach to water issues, but I'm going to ask this panel next time to speak about the framework and to brand what is the path. The path is the 2030 agenda. Every drop counts, but if we explain it in the framework of the SDGs, this hope that Cristina was mentioning will be a reality. Thank you very much. I'm declaring this super interesting event closed. So thanks again for everybody. It was a superb and interesting discussion.